Hi, and welcome to today's IHS Webcast. Improve your negotiating position and achieve cost savings with supplier cost insights. Today's webcast is hosted by IHS, the leading provider of diverse global market and economic information. Today we have a great webcast for you today, and so I'd like to welcome clients that we know well as individuals who are new to our cost service and IHS. My name is Paul Hunt, and I'll be your moderator today. Again, this webcast series is part of our Best Practices in Strategic Sourcing and Procurement webcast series. And these webcasts are aimed at helping clients and introducing prospects to our cost forecasts and analysis, which are done by our pricing and purchasing group here at IHS. And the aim of these is just to improve your negotiating position when you're working with suppliers. So thanks so much for joining us today. I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items for the audience. So we'd like to allow you to ask questions at any time during the webcast today. Type a question in. You can see on the slides there in the Ask a Question area and click Submit. We'll if you need help, there's a help button down there as well. In addition to the asking questions, we also invite you to follow today's conversation at IHS for Supply Chain on Twitter. And invite you to tweet at hashtag IHS Webcast. So that'll be great as well. In addition, we'd like to get feedback on today's topic, as this series is a practical series trying to help clients apply the cost information to day-to-day issues. We'd like to get some feedback on the series and make sure that we're making the correct improvements. There's a survey button down at the bottom, and everyone completing the survey will be entered into a drawing for a Kindle, so keep that in mind. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Paul Robinson. Paul is a senior economist with the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Group. Paul is our ferrous metals expert, and he works extensively with clients, helping them apply our analysis to everyday business issues, like negotiating with suppliers. Paul is a frequent speaker on commodities at conferences internationally, and has been with the group for over 10 years. So I'd like to introduce Paul Robinson and hand the program over to Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, whenever and wherever you are listening. We're going to talk today about some tools to extract cost savings in your upcoming supplier negotiations. So this webcast, like our service as a whole, should have a nice return on investment of your time. So thanks for joining. The starting point for our discussion is, of course, always with the news, looking at the recent movement in commodity prices. I think especially over the past couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of action in exchange traded commodities as measured by our own materials price index, which is a top-level index of commodity prices across 10 different industries. We've seen an 8.4% decline from the recent peak for commodity prices in mid-January. So a nice overall decline. Certainly you see some of the highlights in the articles here with oil prices, but just to point out, compared to recent peaks in a number of different industries, we've seen double-digit declines. Chemical prices are down 15%, non-ferrous are down 14%, shipping rates are down 23%, rubber prices down 18%, and our oil basket is down 14%. So we've seen a lot of downward movement at the commodity level, at the upstream level, but we're not really seeing as much of that downstream price decline quite yet. So what this webcast is going to attempt to do is look at two different case studies on how you all can take advantage of that falling cost environment and really improve your negotiating position to get those cost savings from lower prices upstream. The two case studies we're going to look at, first is a look at a power plant trying to fight against a valve price increase. We know that, we use the example of a valve just because it includes so many different materials, and it's frequently the case that because it's such a highly engineered product and because it's such a widely used product, you can get into these situations where you just contract in a certain fixed increase in prices, and that makes it really difficult to fight back in periods like now where the costs are actually falling. And so we want to look at that and some tools to fight back on those price increases. The second case study will look at tracking alloy costs, especially in highly engineered environments like aerospace and defense. You frequently get these very exotic alloys, steel alloys, nickel alloys, which because of their complicated nature, because of their dependence on many different materials, it can be very difficult to track down the costs and make sure that you're achieving the savings that you should in periods of low prices like now. So we'll just kick it off with that first case study. We're going to look at some margin analysis and then look at a cost breakdown of a valve as a way of really targeting the core components of that valve that are decreasing in price. So just laying out our scenario a little bit more directly, a major power generation company faced another year of 5% price increases on their industrial valve purchases. This has been the case for a number of years, and you continue to see these large increases passing through regardless of what the cost environment is. So our solution for this is the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Service Purchasing Analyzer, which is one of our many tools that we have within the service, and it includes input cost breakdowns and forecasts, as well as a more complete picture by looking at the demand side, the labor productivity side, and so on. So we're just going to look at this specific example through the eyes of that tool as a way of really drawing in ways to fight back against that price increase. So here's the graph. This is what a lot of us are facing in negotiations. The gray line there is prices. The blue line is input costs. You never want to see them moving too far apart, and you especially don't want to see the gray line. As a buyer, you don't want to see that gray line extending much higher than the blue line like it is now. That indicates a multi-year margin expansion, which in a period of short supply or high demand or both, you certainly can expect that to be the case. But as we'll see, this particular industry is not facing that environment, at least over this time period. And in fact, this represents an industry that's ripe for some downward negotiation based on the input cost structure and demand environment. So, is there room to negotiate? I identified some of the problems with negotiating in the industrial valve industry earlier, but I think it represents a difficulty that a lot of buyers are facing, where you might be tied to a single seller. It's a very specific product. You may be stuck in these situations where you have to keep going back to replace the same valve. You may have to get your maintenance buy can be tied to a single seller. So that can be difficult because you don't have other options to play the supplier against. This is also an industry where you see a lot of smaller buyers where you're not going to be able to have the same access to volume discounts that you might see at a larger company. So those of us that aren't the large multinationals that can't place those multi-million-dollar orders and get a price cut on volume, what can they do? And finally, it's another great example just because, as I mentioned, it's a highly engineered product. There's a lot of work that goes into creating a valve. there's a lot of non-manufacturing work that goes into creating a valve, the white-collar workers and the engineers and so on. But we just want to point out that despite all of that, yes, in each of those cases, you're providing for a situation where margins might be higher than the average, more commodity-level, vanilla-type product. But that doesn't mean that the margins should be expanding. They can be high, but they shouldn't be expanding like we saw in that picture a couple of slides ago. So that's going to be sort of the core point that the rest of this discussion in the first case study works around is, yes, we can accept high margins, but we cannot accept expanding margins. So the key to negotiation is, of course, the cost structure. Our purchasing analyzer tool provides this breakdown off the shelf for a number of different products. Industrial valves is one of those examples, and you can see the great depth that we go into here to identify not only the materials, which is, of course, going to be the key to most negotiations, but also looking at direct labor and indirect costs to understand a more complete cost structure. Different steel products, different metal products, and then certainly looking at non-metal products like rubber and plastics, the power and other supplies that go into making the valve, and of course the substantial labor costs associated with an industrial valve, both at the top there with the direct labor and also at the bottom where you have more of the managers and professional workers. So this is what you would get with Purchasing Analyzer. It's a more in-depth cost structure than you're likely to get from your supplier, certainly through negotiation. They're not going to want to tell you bit by bit exactly what they buy. This isn't going to be perfect, but the nice thing is it provides a good starting point, an industry-wide measure, and a way to extract further information from your suppliers, as we'll see in the coming slides. So the first thing we want to do once we have this list, of course, is to identify the key cost components. If we're going to be negotiating this price lower on an argument based on cost, we're going to want to make sure we pick large categories. So what I've done here is just highlight iron foundries, just because it is a significant measure, a significant portion of the cost, over 10% there, and it's going to represent our single greatest opportunity to achieve cost savings, just because it is such a large part of the material cost. So I just pulled out our data on that. You can see here the green bars show the historical data and those 5% increases annual rate that I mentioned earlier. It's certainly not been every year 5%, but if you look over the stretch of the past 5 or 6 years there, you can see fairly consistent growth rates and fairly strong growth rates. And what we want to identify, especially in the case of iron foundries here, is while we still do see prices there going up and still see an increased cost contribution to the valve cost, we want to identify that there's a bit of a kink here, and that in our forecast horizon, the escalation rate is much, much lower. There's a substantial difference between a 5% growth rate and a 2.7% growth rate, and that can mean a lot once you see how it filters through to a large purchase. So in the foundry space, this kink in our forecast is going to represent a really great opportunity to negotiate. Looking at the rest of the components here, before we get too carried away with just looking at just that one component, you can see that I've colored the forecast growth rate for 2013 in each cell here. You get a green light if it's escalating at a higher rate, a yellow light if it's sort of in the middle, and a red light if it's actually contracting. So not only are the iron foundries, that major cost component, showing very tepid increases for 2013 and into the future, but we're seeing outright declines in a number of other components, especially in the steel components there. So just to identify that this isn't, you can cherry pick a major component, and that might not mean that you get a great negotiation standpoint if other components are increasing. But in this case, we're not cherry picking here. Iron foundries is probably fairly typical of the overall picture, and it happens to be a major component, so it's even better choice for that negotiation. And you can see once we weight all of these components and roll it all up to the total input cost, we're seeing the lowest escalation rate on the cost side since 2009, which is, of course, the year of the Great Recession for the global economy. So that's a pretty tough year for comparison, and it's the only year in recent history that's been a lower escalation rate than we're forecasting for the current period. Just understanding, what the actual implications are here. Why are iron foundries coming down in price? I mean, anyone can apply a number to that cost component, but we want to provide some rationale for why that and so many other of the, especially the steel components, are showing a lower forecast in our current period. It really comes down to the cost of that component, the cost of iron foundries. And here we're seeing a low forecast for a lot of the steel raw materials, a lot of the iron raw materials. Iron ore supply is outpacing iron ore demand. As an economist, I find myself always coming back to that simple theory that when supply is growing faster than demand, you're going to expect prices to be falling, and that's what we're seeing here. Iron ore demand, as measured by global steel production, is fairly unexciting. Outside of China, we've seen outright declines. Even including China, it's mostly sideways. And this comes even as a number of the major iron ore miners are expanding their production worldwide. So when supply outpaces demand, you get falling prices. Those falling prices for iron ore are going to filter through into the foundries costs. The only other major component of the foundries cost structure then is labor costs. And in many developed economies where we're viewing these highly engineered castings, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of labor cost escalation. So if the major material cost is declining and labor costs are stagnant, just as we saw in the case of the one step downstream in the actual valves, it's similarly the case in iron foundries, where the material costs are declining and the labor costs are not increasing enough to sway the overall top level. So what does this mean? Well, clearly your supplier is seeing lower costs, and a fall in price in the key cost component is going to be your key negotiating point going forward. And as we've identified just with the two different growth rates, both the pre-2012 growth rate and the post-2012 growth rate for industrial valves, it's a difference of about 3% a year, which is not insubstantial when you're talking about a larger spend. So just by bringing these components to the table, you're able to present a strong case for a 3% savings on this spend. But of course, we promised a wider picture, a wider look at the industry, and I certainly think that's going to be the first thing that your supplier is going to come back to you with. And here I think we can also present an optimistic case from the buy side. Because demand is still slowly recovering from the recession in 2009, it's still, even in our forecast period for 2013, it's still below 2007 levels, those pre-recession levels. And as you can see, there is a decline set in place there for 2013. So not a terribly good picture on the demand side, nothing that would really sway your supplier beyond what we've seen on the cost side. And the final piece is labor productivity. In some sense, you could say that those material costs especially, and the labor costs as well, will be declining based solely on our strong outlook for labor productivity here. That's going to make workers able to do more with less, and it's going to blunt any impact from those raw materials that did come through. So even if our forecast for raw materials proves to be too optimistic, the pushback from labor productivity and weak demand should tip you over here and present you with a good opportunity to push back on a price increase. This isn't to say that the input cost approach is the end-all be-all. In all fairness, I want to always present both sides of the case here, if for nothing else than to keep you on your toes in those negotiations. And here, the input cost breakout can frequently be difficult to obtain. The purchasing analyzer does provide a number of input cost breakdowns off the shelf, but should you find yourself without one, what we found is that it's always the case that if you just put a best guess forward, the great thing about the negotiation is that your supplier can't really tell you that you're wrong without telling you why you're wrong, in which case you've gained information either way. So it's always nice to be able to put forward that best guess input cost breakout, and we provide you with those off the shelf so that you can start those negotiations. And then finally, the next point, of course, is that input costs don't account for the supply-demand balance. And it's frequently the case, especially with downstream products, that you'll see a number of years of price increases in advance of input costs, just because there is that supply-demand balance tipped in favor of the supplier. But the great thing about the tools that we're able to leverage forecasts from all the various IHS groups to really give you a complete picture, looking at both labor productivity and demand in order to better understand the non-cost components that would contribute to the end result on the price picture. So even a sole supplier or producer of a highly engineered product is going to face these same industry dynamics. They're still going to face a falling input cost environment and a falling demand environment. And they may have a little more sway over you just because they are your sole supplier, but that doesn't mean that you don't have the power to push back by presenting this picture to them if they want to maintain your business in the future. Eventually you can engineer your way out of pretty much anything. So they're going to want to hold on to you over the long term, and by providing these tools in a negotiation, you're positioning yourself as best you can to keep your hold in that negotiation going forward. So what are the results of this first scenario here? Input costs are leveling off. You do not have to accept the same increases as recent years for industrial valves. And with savings of as much as 3%, we're talking about, just to do some simple math, $300,000 on $1 million spend, which is not a bad way to spend a day, saving $300,000 for your company. The second case study, looking at another approach to these cost-saving methods, of course, going back to that alloy cost outlook. It's even more obscure in many cases than something that's like an industrial valve that's fairly complex. But the advantage of alloys is that you always have the actual chemical breakdown to lean on. And what we're going to show here is some of the ways you can do some cost tracking via chemistry, which is something that our tool, the alloy cost calculator, does off the shelf. It's just a nice way of pulling together all the various cost components of a given alloy to create a custom forecast, just because in many cases it's very difficult to get a hold of actual price data for alloys, just because they are generally fairly small markets compared to something like, the overall carbon steel market is many, many times larger than the stainless steel market, for example. So the in-depth look at our scenario here, a major aerospace and defense company wants to buy a rare alloy. I've chosen 177PH, which is also known as UNS 17700. It's known for its strength, hardness, formability, and corrosion resistance. For those of you who don't have the benefit of dealing in steels and stainless steels and other alloys, basically the idea is any material is going to have a number of weaknesses. You can mix a different material with it to try and get around those weaknesses. Steel is generally a good material, but it has a number of weaknesses, among them corrosion, and certainly there are many applications where it's not strong enough to make the cut. So this is case where we're going to build a custom cost forecast using the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Service alloy cost calculator as a way of getting around the usual difficulties with projecting out those alloy costs. So we start again with, is there room to negotiate? You know, it's a rare alloy with a relatively small market that can make it much more difficult to push back on suppliers. Many alloys are not widely traded on exchanges. I've used two examples here of ferrochrome and ferrosilicon where the prices are going to be a little bit more difficult to come by. There's not a market clearing necessarily that you can point to immediately for contracting purposes or negotiating purposes. But despite that, you know, we still have some tools at our disposal, and we still have the ability to do a systematic cost tracking. And that's what we're going to do in this case, is use that alloy cost calculator to systematically address each of the alloy costs that builds up to the overall material that we're buying. Within alloy purchasing, we always have to make these two key points. Understanding the nature of your contract is essential. There's not necessarily a completely standard way of setting these contracts up, but frequently it's the case that the supplier will link the prices off of some sort of visible price. Like we mentioned, the London Metal Exchange has these market clearing prices for many materials. But other contracts are a little more vague, and you don't always get the opportunity to link off of those public prices when you're buying something like, you know, a ferrochrome alloy or a ferrosilicon alloy. So understanding what exactly the mechanisms that are guiding your price is extremely important. But also the specific chemistry breakdown. If you create a cost-based look rather than a chemistry-based look, you can get very different results. So if you break down your total material by each material's contribution to cost rather than each material's contribution to chemistry, you can get a different picture. And I'll show an example of that because I do think it's a sort of a difficult concept to just picture without something staring at you in the face. So we'll look at that, and we'll also look at how indexing by price can sometimes be a little inaccurate, and so that's why we recommend indexing by chemistry within the alloy cost calculator. Here is the chemistry for the product that we're looking at. It's 72% iron, 18% chromium, 2% aluminum, 1% silicon, and 8% nickel. You'll be forgiven for not knowing the chemical symbols along the side there, but there will be a quiz at the end there for you, just to make sure everyone's paying attention. Just kidding. So what the alloy cost calculator does is it takes those chemistry breakdowns of each material, and it weights those materials' contribution to the overall cost index by its chemistry. So 72% of our iron forecast is added to 2% of our aluminum forecast, 1% of our ferrosilicon forecast, and so on. And what you get when you add up each of those components is this graph right here, a nice stacked bar chart that not only provides a cost forecast for the material, which would be the very top of each of those bars, but it also provides you with the contribution from each material. So you know if you're sitting in mid-2009 here that much of the declines came from the ferrous component and from the ferrochrome component rather than the nickel component, which still is accounting for well over half of the cost in that very weak period in the middle. And then going forward, of course, we can provide another example from the historical data in early 2011 where nickel prices were spiking much higher relative to the other materials here, and you can see the results as it filters through to the final price. This picture also tells you, probably unsurprisingly given that their contribution to chemistry was so low, but that both aluminum and ferrosilicon, which on many of your screens you probably won't even be able to detect, although I can promise you they are there, that they're not major contributors to the total price of this product. So just to look at, because I mentioned it, I wanted to show the difference between a price and a chemistry weighting. So if what we did in 2002 Q1, if we weighted by the contribution to price of each of the materials in this product, and then we just set that index forward, versus what would happen if we weighted it in the manner that we do in the U.S. alloy cost calculator, which is by the contribution to chemistry. Here you see the results. And you know, surprisingly to me, actually, it works okay for most of the time. The problem is that in some periods where just one or two of the materials is spiking higher, especially spiking much higher than the others, you can get these periods of huge disjoint. In 2007, when nickel prices were much stronger than other materials, if you had weighted by price, you would have totally missed that spike in your material costs. Whereas if you weight by chemistry, you can see it filter through, and you can be better prepared for those price increases and know that you have to hedge around them or hold off on buys even. So this just shows, you know, most of the time you're probably going to be okay, but it's those periods of extreme volatility, which are the most dangerous for other reasons, also are the most dangerous in this case in terms of not setting up your indexing properly. So why is this important? You know, of course, it's important to understand the whole picture of alloy cost and price movements. If you are able to break down into that stacked bar chart, like I said, you can not only see where your overall price horizon is headed, but you can also get an idea of where each material is headed and what it's contributing to the overall price. So you know the pressure points to negotiate at. You know, again, going back to that first example, we don't want to just go and say across the board, you know, we know your costs are lower, why don't you lower the price? You're going to be much more successful if you target this approach, and if you are able to say, you know, hey, nickel prices have come down, or hey, iron ore prices have come down. You know, why don't we see this in our prices? Why is this not filtering through? And in the case of the alloy that we're looking at, of course, price declines have mostly passed, but we did want to point out that prices are going to be flat in the future. And just to make sure that you did achieve the cost savings that you should have when prices were falling, you know, you're able to use the tool to recognize those periods where you should have achieved those savings. Again, with the shortcomings, you know, many-handed economists always have to say, well, on the other hand, and here I'll point out that there's no accounting for supply-demand strength in this approach. Contrary to in the purchasing analyzer, we're not able to provide a specific demand forecast for each of the alloys. It's a little more difficult in this case just because, again, they are specific markets. They're very small markets frequently. There's also no accounting for overhead within the tool, but that's certainly something you can add. The reason that we don't is because there's so much variance from company to company that it makes it difficult to really say the degree to which that can be a good negotiating point, just because it's going to be a company-specific situation. So we do have forecasts within our tools for transportation costs, for, of course, all the various other overhead components, but we do not provide them directly in the tool. So the alloy cost calculator is a starting point for negotiations. It's a starting point for planning purposes, but it might not be the ending point in some cases. It carries you much further than many of, you know, certainly than any other tool out there on the market, and certainly more than just depending on your supplier to provide a fair price increase, but it's certainly not the ending point. So what are the results? You know, we saw that many ferroalloys have come down in recent years, especially those feeding into this product like nickel and ferrochrome. And you just need to make sure that the contracts are set up to take advantage of that. You can link off of our prices. You can link off of, you know, other publicly available prices. But in this case, we're talking a 33% decline over 2 years in the cost of producing this alloy, which is, you know, that's a substantial savings. And if you're not not systematically tracking those material costs, you certainly could have missed at least some of that decline over the past couple of years. So what's the bottom line? Tremendous commodity price volatility has placed additional need for reliable and timely price information. We don't want you to be out there paying too much. It's important to be able to fight back on price increases. It's important to be able to achieve cost savings. And we hope we've presented just a couple of the tools that we offer within the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Service to achieve those savings. We've got more than 40 years of experience doing this and an established reputation as one of the most accurate economic forecasters. It doesn't do us any good if we provide you with these tools and tell you that things are going to go down if they continue to go up. We stand by our accuracy and our ability to achieve above market average accuracy in our forecast. And we've got a number of other tools that really help you track your costs, tell you when you can make the buys, when is the most advantageous time to place a buy. And in general, over all of our clients, we achieve a cost savings on average of about 1 to 1.5% of total material spend, which, that's why I say this is a presentation with an ROI. So hopefully it's been worth your time, and hopefully we can result in some that both this presentation and the service will result in some real bottom line savings. I do want to point out just some of the other features beyond the procurement piece, the specific purchasing piece. Our forecasts are used for contracting, benchmarking, cost planning. Maybe we don't necessarily want to use the tool for making a buy in the next 2 to 3 months. Maybe it's more tracking costs over a longer term, or planning for a long-term contract, or really doing a benchmarking on how your procurement performance has matched market averages over the past decade. The nice thing about the tool is we forecast out not only the very near term, but we go out as much as 10 years on a quarterly basis. So you're able to really get that insight into the medium and long term that you're not able to get in a lot of other tools to really plan properly for the future. So just some examples, some more specific examples of savings that have been achieved with the tool, just so we can show proven results here. A transportation equipment manufacturer saved $2.2 million in a single buy. Again, I can't think of too many other ways that I'd like to spend a day than saving $2 million on a single negotiation. Another client saved $1 million buying polyethylene based on the advice from our experts. And the real big one here, and the sort of core history of the service, being with the Defense Contract Audit Agency with the United States Department of Defense. Their use of our tool over a number of years was able to save American taxpayers over $500 million on just 3 different contracts, which is, especially, from a taxpayer standpoint, of course, we love to see this, but certainly from a client basis, we like to see this as well. True cost savings from the U.S. government there. And then finally, a building materials manufacturer saved 10 to 15% on aluminum buys based on contract timing. So as you can see, we do have a proven track record of saving money. We do have a proven track record across a number of different materials and across a number of different geographies. I just want to flash this slide up as a sort of closing point here, just to show the breadth of our coverage and the depth of our coverage. I know I did focus a little more on metals within this discussion, but we have a wide variety of forecasts in different industries like chemicals, building materials, energy prices, labor. We've got over 700 wages from across the world, which can be a really nice way of localizing costs and addressing those geographic differences in production costs and comparing the cost of production across different areas. So that's a key component. We have prices. certainly within North America, Europe, Asia, and then outside of those three core regions as well, a couple hundred different prices and wages. So in total, the global pricing and purchasing service does offer over 1,000 different prices and wages. So we're certain to be able to provide you with exactly what you're looking for, regardless of where you're buying it. And with that, I just want to thank everyone. We're going to open it up to questions in a minute, but first I'll send it back to the other Paul, to Mr. Hunt, for some closing notes here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. That was a great presentation. Very helpful with lots of good practical advice for when clients are negotiating with suppliers, looking at input costs and just escalation rates, and not just automatically accepting the same increase each year. So there's some great helpful advice there. And I one of the things on the questions, we encourage you all to go and type in some questions. I know a number of people have. One thing I wanted to clarify on slide 21, which was at the end of the input cost section case study, there was a misprint. It said there was a savings of 3% on $1 million, which we had in typo of 300,000, and it should be 30,000. So a number of you pointed that out, and we appreciate that. So we'll make that change in the final slide deck. The other thing I wanted just to mention quickly was that one of the things, as a thank you for joining the webcast today, all attendees, if you can receive our IHS Commodity Price Watch report. Clients of the service receive this as part of their regular service deliverables. But for those of you that are trying to learn more about IHS and our pricing and purchasing service, it's a great way to get an overview of the type of analysis that we cover on a regular basis. So it again, as Paul was saying, it branches out and gives you the full breadth of coverage, everything from labor rates all the way through to the steel analysis that and metals analysis that Paul was talking about today. So in order to do that, you complete the survey, and you will receive a IHS Commodity Price Watch report. The other thing I just wanted to point out was some speaking engagements and events on the procurement side. We will have a booth at the upcoming ISM Annual Conference in Dallas, Texas. So come by the booth. If I imagine many of you will be there. It's April 28th to May 1st, and we're in booth 801. And there'll be a lot of different experts there from our pricing and purchasing team. So make sure to stop by. There's a few other events there that I'll let you look through as well. And then we just wanted to remind folks to complete the survey. You don't want to miss out on the opportunity to receive the Kindle Drawing. And again, this is a series, we're trying to make them as helpful as possible to folks. So we welcome suggestions on how to make these more effective. The other thing I'd like to do is just again, we did receive a lot of questions. So let me move us to the next slide, and let's go to the questions that we received in. One of the questions that we had, so I think we'll go to questions now, Paul, if that works for you. One of the questions we have here is, can you comment at a high level as to where labor rates in China versus labor rates in Mexico are headed in the next 2 to 3 years? This is a interesting question that I know has been coming up in a number of our client meetings. Paul, could you comment on that?
Sure, definitely. And I should highlight first, before we get going too far here, that the great thing about the service is that there are experts in each of the various industries, so you can always count on getting a great answer. I'm not the labor analyst, but it is an area that we've been looking at across the organization recently. And there I think we've shown a lot of optimism on Mexico versus China in terms of a total manufacturing cost picture, and as well as specifically to the point of the question of on a labor cost standpoint as well. The gap between wages in current period between Mexico and China is still fairly substantial at this point. It's the escalation rate that's really important, and I know that that's what the question was looking to address. I think over the next 2 to 3 years, you're still going to see a pretty substantial gap. But when we look at sort of more the medium to longer term, much more like a 10-year horizon, you're going to start to see labor costs in Mexico just closer to say 20% higher or so than in China, rather than now where they're multiples higher. And the thing there is of course, to keep in mind that labor costs are just one part of the total cost picture, and that labor productivity in many cases is much higher in Mexico than in China, just because of the greater access to capital. And then you also have the lower transportation costs to major markets like the United States. And then also, something we point out with Mexico is the free trade agreements that Mexico has with the United States and with Brazil and with Europe, which is an advantage that China does not have. So I do want to answer the labor question, but also just from a wider cost standpoint, there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic about Mexico over the next 5 to 10 years.
Thanks, Paul. We had another question which has to deal with the Allied Cost Calculator. The client is asking, they understand the chemistry weighting, but how did you calculate the price weighting?
Sure. So, and I maybe should have spent a little more time on that, but I didn't want to get people too bogged down. But I love talking about this. The idea is that if you look at the total contribution to cost in a given time period, so say we're looking at an alloy now, and 10% of the cost is nickel, 20% of it is ferrochrome, and 70% of it is iron. If you hold those weights constant and assume that's your contribution to cost or to price, if you hold those weights constant and then use your projections for each of those materials, what I'm saying is you're going to get a very disjointed picture, because not all of those materials are going to be escalating at the same rate. So if nickel is 10% now, and 5 years from now nickel prices have doubled and everything else is still the same, that 10% will no longer hold, and your weight of 10% there then is going to be incorrect 10 years from now, and it's going to throw off your results. So weighting by chemistry, you're essentially weighting by a more physical contribution to the material rather than a cost or price contribution from each material. So I hope that makes sense now, but it's a simple mistake to make, but unfortunately that also means it's a very common mistake to make. And I just wanted to point that out, that we have not made that mistake, and also just as a heads up to clients and prospects to avoid that in their analysis.
Thanks, Paul. From the first case study on the valves, we had a similar question in terms of the mechanics. Where did the percent cost breakdown in the PowerPoint valve example come from?
Sure. So in many cases, we start from publicly available sources. The very core of our data comes from the U.S. government, from the Census of Manufacturers. The difficulty with that and many other surveys is that because they're publicly available, and because they rely on surveys from the various producers of the materials and of the components, they very frequently have categories mislabeled and materials miscategorized. So what can happen is you get these all other categories that account for 30% of the cost or 40% of the cost. So what we do is we take a lot of publicly available information and take it that next step and provide that additional value add by breaking down the categories a step further. And the way we do that is just through our contacts among our clients and among other companies around the world, and we're able to really use our industry knowledge to push those numbers the next step further.
Thanks, Paul. We had another question from one of the listeners. The question is that suppliers, producers are becoming reluctant to set contract pricing based upon transparent indices, and they use the example of the steel CRU index pricing. How does a strategic purchasing person respond to this reluctancy? Any advice?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll take a 5-second segue on that, just because of the CRU steel prices have gotten a lot of play recently. The story there, for those of you not in the steel industry, is that CRU provided, is one of the many suppliers of steel prices that were frequently being contracted off of. But the problem is the steel mills put themselves in a position where they were setting contracts based off of these indexes but below them. So take what the index value is and we'll give you a 5% discount based off of that. That's great negotiations amongst buyers, but the problem is that the index is made up of prices contributed by buyers. So there was this circularity, and the index was a little dirtied as a result, and it ended up moving sideways because you've got people contracting off of it, linked directly to it above and below, and sort of locking the steel mills into a position where they can't really push prices around like they'd like to. So the questioner is exactly right that there's been a reluctance among steel mills to use that particular index. But from a wider discussion, it's not so much that these indexes, I would say that it's not that they're becoming less popular, it's just that they don't want to be linked directly to them if they're below them. They don't want to be giving discounts off of those indexes. So what I think is going to be the case going forward, especially in the very near term, is much more direct linkages off of these prices rather than discounts on them. If you're a large buyer, that might mean that you're not getting the discount that you used to. But if you're a small buyer, it might mean that you do get closer to the industry average. The other thing I want to point out is that just because it's increasingly the case in a number of different markets that you don't have to rely on your supplier to contract off of the specific item that you want to. There are a number of different hedges that are available nowadays. Just because the question was about steel, I'll address that. And there I think you're starting to see a little bit more play from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange hot rolled contract. You're starting to see a little more play out of the Singapore Exchange iron ore swaps. So there's starting to be a lot more options out there for buyers, pardon the pun with options, but options out there for buyers to really hedge around the price increases that they're seeing. And so even though this is a case, the steel market and the CRU price specifically is a case where there's not as much freely available contracting off of that price as maybe in the past. You might have to push a little bit more to get contracted off of there. It still is the case that even if you are seeing a lot of reluctance from your supplier, that there are other options for you. And so that's what we would say. If you can push as hard as you want, and I certainly think that you're not going to get an absolute no on this specific case. But even if you do, you can always take your planning elsewhere and hedge around that contract, even if you do stay with the same supplier.
Okay, thank you, Paul. There were a number of questions around the different tools, and I think one of the things that we'll do is we'll get back to individuals with specific answers. But one question that came up a couple of times that we could answer, Paul, is just how many different items have a purchasing analyzer cost breakdown within that tool?
Sure. So within the purchasing analyzer, which is available to our clients. We have over 150 different prices available, and that's breakdowns both in the United States as well as we have a number in Europe as well. So that spreads across a number of different industries. Again, it's not just metals. We have upstream in there, so you can look at something like hot rolled sheet or polyethylene, polypropylene, ethylene, propylene. And then we also have further downstream materials as well, like an industrial valve or machinery and equipment, construction machinery. Those sorts of items are also available within the tool. So it's nice because it spreads across geographies. It spreads across the supply chain, upstream, downstream. Like most of our tools, it is the case that it's truly global in nature.
Okay, Paul, and it looks like we have time for one more question, and this one is from the chemical sector. The listener asks how to get out of price formulas in chemical sourcing after years of direct pass-through by the supplier. So I think in some ways, how do you break the cycle of just accepting the supplier's annual cost increase?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a perfect example of what we saw in the industrial valve scenario in the first case study. A lot of times, especially downstream, but certainly also in chemicals a little further upstream as well, you get these cozy relationships where you pass through a certain amount each year. I think you hit it right on the head there, Paul, that you do just have to break the cycle. You can present them with a longer-term view. I would say the only difference between that negotiation and any other is that you're going to be coming to them with a much wider time horizon to be able to look at these negotiations and to be able to say, hey, not only are our costs decreasing in the future, and not only have they decreased over the past 6 months, but we've been overpaying you for 4 or 5 years, so it's time to correct that. You're certainly not going to, immediately be able to adjust this relationship, but I think you have to provide a starting point, and that starting point has to be to suggest that the relationship has to change in the future. And the best way to do that is to present the negotiation as having been advantageous to your supplier in the past. You can come to them and say, this has been very good for you. We appreciate the relationship we've had over the past couple of years, and we don't want that to go away. But we've been overpaying you, and we're not going to anymore. So I think just stepping back and looking at it from a longer-term view and just presenting the picture that there has been, a stronger escalation in price than cost, even in, whether it's the case or not, depending on your industry or your product category, that even adjusting for supply and demand, you may find yourself in a situation where the price escalation has been much greater than it should have been. So just take a step back, look at the longer-term view, and provide that analysis, as we have available in the tool and as I've done here today.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think having the confidence of the input costs and their escalation rates really can help a lot of people break those annual increase price cycles. Well, yeah, I just want to thank everyone for attending today's webcast. There were many questions that we weren't able to get to in a limited time. We'll be following up with everyone and answering all the questions. In many cases, we'll try to get in touch with you over the phone. A lot of people had questions about the tools and specific cases on how to get the most out of some of these, the allied cost analyzer and the purchasing analyzer. So we'll reach out to you and get in touch with you on that. Don't forget to sign up for the Commodity Price Watch, and the recording of today's event will be posted within 24 hours using the same URL that you accessed for today's live event. And in addition, just take it only takes 2 minutes to fill out the survey, and you'll be entered in for that Kindle Fire device, and we'll announce the winner of that within 2 weeks. So thanks again for joining us today, and have a great day. Bye.